Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Thursday, September 25th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Jacob, hi, how you doing?
Hey Jessica, good to be with you again. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, good to be here together. It is day 720 of the war. An IDF soldier, Staff Sergeant Chalachus Shimon Demalish, 21, of the Nachal Brigade's 932nd Battalion from Beersheba, was killed in a Hamas sniper attack in Gaza City yesterday. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is heading to New York and the United Nations, as well as a meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump in Washington on Monday. And on the tarmac last night, he dismissed Palestinian recognition at the UN as, quote, shameful capitulation. There were hundreds protesting the prime minister and the government's latest actions and statements at Ben Gurion Airport as the prime minister departed for New York. We'll discuss all the latest at the United Nations, including U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to end the Gaza war and the French proposal for dealing with Gaza. Stay with us. Okay, so Jacob, let's first start with Trump's meeting with Muslim leaders at the UN. Those leaders included from Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan. As you've written about, the meeting was about how the war would end. Why don't you take us through it a little bit and we can get into some of the details?
Sure, this was a much anticipated meeting, I would say, with President Trump saying ahead of time that they were going to be discussing how to maybe end the Gaza war. And the way to go about doing that was for him to present a plan that all of the Arab and Muslim states participating, there were 8 countries. There were some interesting countries of those 8, including Indonesia, Pakistan, and Turkey. So Muslim countries that are also, I guess, going to be playing a role, at least as the way the U.S. would like to see it. Definitely Pakistan's surprising, and given that it has not been talked about specifically in relation to Gaza until now. But the hope is that a plan that has a lot of U.S. support can actually galvanize the assistance from countries not just in the region, but actually much further beyond.
And part of the Muslim world. Yeah.
Right. So what President Trump tries to do is lay out what they now are calling a 21-point plan. My understanding of which is that it is very much based off of lots of different parts of the Tony Blair plan from the former British Prime Minister. We scooped it last week about what's in it. That plan focuses more on the JITA, which is this transitional body that is going to be that's envisioned to be taking over Gaza for this temporary transitional period before it's handed over to the Palestinian Authority. And what Trump talks about is that, but also how do we get to that plan? How do we get to this transitional period? How do we end the war? So he talks about the release of the remaining hostages and a permanent ceasefire. My understanding is that the release of the hostages will take place over a several-week period, and then we get to the place where we can have a security force come in that's backed by some of these Muslim and Arab countries, and this transitional force that's Palestinian but not PA, until the PA is ready and reformed to take over the reins. There's a lot of questions on whether Israel will support this proposal because there still is a role envisioned for the PA, and of course whether Hamas will go along. And I guess what the administration hopes is that if it gets enough Arab and Muslim pressure on Hamas to agree to these terms, that will be enough finally for them to capitulate and say, okay, we're willing to release all the hostages. I think it's going to require a phased disarmament as opposed to what I think Israel would like to see, which is something much more instant. But I think what is clearly going to require to happen for this war to end is for both sides to maybe give on something that they're currently right now saying they're not willing to do. And that's what I think this meeting was trying to build momentum toward that plan. And I think the main headline that came out, which is what we reported a little bit behind the scenes, is that Trump assured the countries that he would not be allowing Israel to annex parts of the West Bank, any or all parts of the West Bank, which I think is pretty significant the U.S. until now has been very quiet about its position on annexation. They've actually basically the stance they've taken is to simply criticize the Western countries who've decided to recognize a Palestinian state, arguing that this is this unilateral step that actually provokes an Israeli reaction. And what were you thinking? You knew that Israel was going to react this way, kind of, I guess, accepting that as a given that Israel has a right to make this decision to annex parts of the West Bank. But now I think what I've heard in the past couple of days is actually despite this public stance that's been very wary of criticizing Israel, privately there has been some warnings. I would say some soft warnings from the Trump administration, warning Israel against this move. I think what's interesting is I spoke with an Israeli official who told me this, and they said that yes, there's been some private concern, but this is not the end of the conversation, and we're actually going to pick it back up when President Trump meets with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington on Monday. And we're hoping that maybe we can convince Trump to shift his approach to this issue. I think if there is a decision not to allow annexation, I expect that the U.S. will feel that it has to give Israel something. One of the ideas that's been floated around, I think, and I spoke with one Israeli official who said this, is that it could be taking parts of Area A, which is currently under Palestinian security and civilian control, and moving that to Area B, which would give Israel also security control over the areas, and then maybe moving parts of Area B, which is under Israeli security control, but not Israeli civilian control, moving that to Area C and giving Israel control over those areas as well. So basically giving Israel more control over parts of the West Bank, something that would probably violate the Oslo Accords. But I think what Israel maybe could argue that this is something that the Arab countries can swallow. If they're not going to accept annexation, they're going to have to accept something else in response for these unilateral steps by other countries that are in Europe that have been taking this decision to recognize a Palestinian state. That's one idea that's being floated around. It's possible that the response will be significant enough to even that actually Israel will be cautious to even take that kind of step. I think there are a lot of countries that maybe are holding out in the EU, like for example Italy right now, which has been not willing to join the growing tide of countries recognizing a Palestinian state. But I think the comments that are being coming out of their leadership recently is hinting that actually they're at their wits' end as well. And that maybe that kind of step, even if it's not annexation, might be too much. So Israel's going to have to thread a very difficult needle. And Netanyahu is in a very difficult position because his coalition is so insistent on a move towards annexation right now. I think he's coming at a very difficult time, I think, both at the international scale and at the domestic scale.
So after all of this, what did Steve Witkoff, who has been, a kind of a Mideast envoy to Trump, what did he have to say? What were his reactions to all of it? Since he was obviously on the ground as well.
Right. He's optimistic again, saying he's confident of a breakthrough in Gaza that can come in the next few days. The cynic in me would remind readers and listeners that we've heard this kind of rhetoric before, and it hasn't really panned out. But I think what the U.S. feels right now is that until now, the approach had been to try to deal with the Gaza day after issue once the ceasefire is already in place. And that was kind of the Biden approach of you get to phase one of the deal, and then once there's a ceasefire, that's when we can start negotiating the terms of what Gaza will look like the day after. But the new approach, and I think that's been pushed by Tony Blair, and I think that's convinced the Trump administration, that took them a while to get here, is that actually, no, you can't even get that ceasefire unless you have understandings already in place regarding the day after. And what I understood from this meeting is that they actually did get the Arab and Muslim countries on board for this plan. It still is going to require getting Israel and Hamas, the two main players, as well, and that's going to be the most difficult part. But now that you have these pieces in place, that we actually might be in a much better situation to try to get the ceasefire as well. Everyone loves the line, time will tell. But I think that I don't have a more accurate prediction of what's going to unfold. I do think I would be a lot more cautious if I were Steve Witkoff right now, given the amount of times that they've thought that they were within days of a breakthrough. It's going to require the sides to make decisions that they have not been willing to make until now. So to assume that's going to happen, I think, would be going against the grain.
Right, especially with Netanyahu now heading to the White House on Monday, and to the UN first. Okay. Let's take a break and continue with talk of plans because we have this French international stabilization mission that you wrote about. So stay with us as we talk about that. Okay, so let's talk about this French plan. Of course, it all starts off at the UN with France announcing their recognition of a Palestinian state at the UN, joined by Belgium, Luxembourg, Malta, San Marino, and Andorra, following the UK, Australia, Canada, and Portugal a day earlier. And then you have all your write ups about this French stabilization mission for Gaza, which I'm wondering how does that jive with the Blair plan? That was what I kept on going back to, and you'll take us through that. But let's first talk about France and this plan and the discussion of it. What does it look like, and have we been expecting this?
Sure. So this was a proposal that I got a hold of a few days ago and was able to publish it earlier this week. But I think it's important to keep in mind as we're talking about all these different possibilities for what post-war day after in Gaza could look like in terms of the security angle, because the Blair plan focused a little bit more on the governing body, that this transitional Palestinian governing body that was going to be technocratic, but is less specific regarding what the security force will do. It does give its own idea on the Blair plan, but this is another option that I think the French have been pushing, and specifically with the UK as well. And what it envisions is also having Arab countries. They give a list of, I think, five or so. The Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, and Egypt are named as these likely sponsors of this stabilization mission. And what's interesting about the proposal that I noticed when getting a hold of this two-page paper is that it specifically talks about the idea of disarming Hamas. And that is something that, if you look at the Blair proposal that we published about, does not get into that specific term. They do talk about the concept of DDR, which is the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. But it doesn't mention Hamas by name in the Blair proposal, whereas this one specifically does. And I guess the fact that you have these five Arab countries in writing now, so somewhat publicly, even though I don't think this plan was supposed to be public until we got a hold of it, but the idea that these countries are now being these countries are now being named, as opposed to before, where I think a lot of it's been willingness to quietly say that we're open to participating and sending troops, but now we're actually seeing a little willingness to go a little bit further. And we'll obviously have to see if these countries will be held to those promises. But the fact that France believes that they have enough confidence in their contacts with the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emirates and the Jordanians and the Egyptians, that actually this could be realistic. And what's notable is that France itself is saying that we're willing to send troops. I did speak to some other people about this plan and who felt it wasn't as realistic, that the idea of relying on, and it's going to call into question Trump's plan as well, or Blair's plan, that because who also talk about Arab forces or international forces. What the skeptic I spoke to who was familiar with this plan said, a government official, that the idea of having Arab countries actually working to disarm Hamas, trying to literally turn their weapons towards Hamas troops in Gaza, they feel is very unrealistic. That they feel the only scenario where you'll have Arab troops willing to go into Gaza is if Hamas is already in the process of disarming on its own or agreeing to its own terms for handing over its weapons or putting its weapons in some sort of warehouse.
Right. How does that happen?
Yeah, I think that's an unlikely scenario. And I think that's what's so difficult about getting a deal on this, is that Hamas is not willing to disarm simply on its own, and the Arab forces I don't think are willing to go into battle against these troops, against these fighters in Gaza. So it's going to be a difficult, again, needle of the thread to get the countries to commit. But I think when you speak to different European officials about this kind of plan, they say, no, actually, if we just try to negotiate and hold Hamas's feet to the fire, that maybe there is some sort of gradual disarmament process that they would be willing to accept. The key for that to happen is going to be a pathway to a Palestinian state that gives Hamas an out to say that we don't need to continue fighting. that is not something that the current Israeli government, possibly other governments as well, are willing to accept. So again, we're in a very, very difficult place. But I think what the U.S. is trying to do right now, given that they're also taking on a proposal in Blair's that is somewhat similar to this concept of having Arab forces in Gaza, expecting some gradual disarmament of Hamas, is that, look, we're at this point where we're trying to give both the parties, Israel and Hamas, an off-ramp here. And we think this plan is the best way to do that. You can say no and not take it, but then you're on your own. And I think that's kind of the way that the Trump administration has approached Russia-Ukraine war at this point, that yes, they'd like to bring it about to an end, but if they feel that the parties are not interested in doing so, they're just going to leave. And I think in that scenario, that's not one that Israel really wants to be in. Specifically, the idea of them being the only one in charge of Gaza, yes, that is maybe the fantasy of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who want to occupy the Strip and rebuild settlements there, but I don't think that's where necessarily Netanyahu is, at least definitely not in the long term, maybe in the short term when he's trying to keep his coalition together. But in the long term, I don't think that's where Israelis are or where Netanyahu is. And I think that they might be looking for an off-ramp that, yes, we'll have to compromise and allow some sort of pathway to an eventual state that doesn't have to be tomorrow, or at least give the Palestinian Authority a chance to be in a better position to eventually transition into a role into Gaza. But on the other hand, we're given a lot of opportunities here, and they came up at the UN when you had this speech from the president of Indonesia, who's speaking in Hebrew, saying shalom at the end of his speech, and talking about the importance of Israel's right to security, and offering up as many or more than 20,000 troops to participating in this theoretical stabilization force in Gaza. There are a lot of opportunities here. Of course, I think the grand prize of Saudi normalization, again, which now feels like a total fantasy, could once again become an option, because I think what these Arab countries, according to officials that I speak with who are involved in trying to get them on board, is that there's a realization now that they don't want this conflict to be solved. They don't want this conflict to be managed. They want it to be solved. And therefore, they're willing to pay a price. It will require them to keep holding their feet to the fire, and making sure that they're not just making platitudes of statements saying that we're willing to help, but actually doing the work. But you do have this unique opportunity here where the president of the largest Muslim country in the world is willing to help Israel ensure its security. Obviously, it's going to require leaders to take risks, but you might not have another opportunity like this in the future.
All right. We'll see what the rest of this week brings. So for the moment, or the day, right? Thank you, Jacob, for telling us what it all is about and taking us through it. We'll obviously keep on talking about it.
Thanks, Jessica.
For sure. And the rest of you, thank you for listening, and we'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. For now, Shana Tova, have yourselves a good day. We'll see you soon.